Yeah, for this one first with it, we're going to, before we get to the topic, I would ask for people to anything that they can give, if they could, give to my Patreon. I'm posting it right now, right here. You'll see right in the chat. It goes from $1 all the way up, and it basically on this before we get to the topic, it's basically $1 all the way up to for the minimum per month, all the way up to $100, and once you get to the $100 level, you get to suggest topics that can supersede the actual podcast topic of the day, and it's something that you might want to consider. The $50 level will make you a prime level person. Later on down the road, we'll probably get up to giveaways for the $50 and $100 level people. Probably do that like quarterly or something. And probably yearly for the lower level people, except for like the $1 ones, unless we get enough $1 people that I can do like one winner for that. But beyond that point, let's get into the actual topic. It's Obama discussing the idea of my brother's keeper. And we need to really discuss what this actually means, because we need to actually start discussing this idea with it. Now, we need to discuss it from two specific points in which we're going to see where you're probably going to be angry with this, but actually refuting it. Number one is we're going to be looking at the first point, which is if he actually believed this point, we would see the fact of him supporting his half-brother in Kenya. We see that he has not visited. We see that he has not given any financial support whatsoever to this date. And because of this, with it, he's living on his own, basically pretty much nothing but like a steel type of structure that would be like basically equal to like what we would call a equal, like the same type of things that we would build like tool sheds out of, and that's what he has his home built out of, and it's not that large. And yet we see Barack Obama having multiple homes, and yet he could easily afford just to kind of toss a few bucks his half brother's way. When we look at that, so even in theory, we could see his him not believing it, even in theory. Now, when we look at in theory with it, I mean, if you're going to go in on something with it, at least believe what you're saying with it. And he was making mention of things on the Trayvon Martin. Well, with Trayvon Martin, when we actually get the actual story on that Trayvon Martin story, we see that Trayvon Martin was actually a horrible individual. He was a gang member. He was basically running the streets. He was essentially kind of like the bottom of the barrel person that was basically that assaulted basically, you're talking a neighborhood watchman, basically, and that's what happened. He assaulted a neighborhood watchman, and the neighborhood watchman killed him out of self-defense, and that's how Trayvon Martin died. So the idea of this being established is really kind of fraudulent. Just right there. Now we're talking, these are the 2 points in which he was talking about. Now he's talking about this on college campuses and saying you should be your neighbor's keeper. Well, so now we get to the next part of arguing against it. Now we've already defeated his own case from his own aspect of the person that it was essentially established in the name thereof by basically looking at the actual character of the individual. The individual was a horrible individual that's really, it should never have been named in him, because we're talking, this was bottom of the barrel and he assaulted someone, and it was based on self-defense that he ended up being a victim of self-defense because he was trying to beat the person to death with a Snapple bottle. And then when we look at the other cases, we know the president doesn't even believe in the actual theory of being your brother's keeper in the actual literal sense. So when we look at this beyond that point, we can see that he can state all he wants from that aspect, but if you're not going to practice what you preach, how can you legitimize any of this? Which means that what we need to view this as is we need to go on to our next thing, which is statements that have been made from what would be a rational thought process, which would be from Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand goes on the fact when she was been asked about do you believe your brother's she's been asked by different people, do you believe that you're your brother's keeper, and she is vehemently denied that and said absolutely not. And she believes that you should only focus on your own self. Now, when we look at that, we can actually go to the idea of you can actually go on the idea of the 7 virtues of Christianity, even, and it says. You can basically go in the idea of those 7 virtues, which are the exact opposite of the 7 sins, which is faith, is believing the right things, hope, taking a positive view on the future, the good things will prevail. Charity is concerned for and acting, helping of others, but charity is done on a voluntary level, and it's done from person to person. And it's done specifically for those you know on a specific level, and you know that that have actually been wronged. Not necessarily acting as your brother's keeper, though. And fortitude is never giving up. Justice is being fair and equitable to others, which is what you're talking about. Pushing for equality. Prudence is the care and moderation with money, which is basically not wasting money, which means you would the idea of not going into debt, and temperance. And this is from one of them, and temperance, the moderation of needed things and abstinence from things which are not needed, which is still continuing on that same idea of prudence. So when we start to look at that, it ends up focusing on more the necessary things of what would make someone content. And in and if we compare these with so the idea of this is none of them seem to be the idea of, when we look at those things of being, of actually the idea of charity. Charity is not necessarily meaning just in general, just actually being your brother's keeper in general, because the idea of that with it, when we look at some of the other virtues, we see that basically if you were to be your brother's keeper, you would essentially not be able to focus on any of the time of the other brother's on any of the other things. And this is very, very important. So when we start to look at that, is it's very important to understand that that we end up seeing that that to be your brother's keeper, it would essentially be denying the actual other virtues, and this would be the act of insanity to actually do such a thing, because essentially you'd be focusing all of your effort, and that, when we look at it, would be essentially would be going against the idea of basically of justice, because you're not being equitable with people, because essentially with it's not just with others, it's also being with yourself. You're not being equitable with yourself, because justice is meant to be equality with everyone. And if you're essentially denying yourself equity, you're essentially causing a problem there. It says with others, with it, it would it's under the assumption that you would when it goes with this, it's under the assumption that one would actually be putting the interest of their self over others as an actual natural idea first. And this is important to understand, and as a basically natural form of survival. Now, what people have actually assumed is they've assumed to take on some of these things above that, which is the product of insanity, which is completely insane. Because if we take the idea of some of the other things with it, is basically is on the other end is on the seven deadly sins. We never see that we never see one part of the entry into the idea of self-preservation as an actual sin in itself. And there's a reason why, because it's considered to actually not be, it's considered to be just natural to actually the human in itself, which means it's automatically assumed that that's going to be your first nature, and that's going to be what you do naturally first, and then everything else is after. Like even when it says with greed, it's not necessarily the desire for material wealth or gain. It's when it becomes when it overwhelms your natural function. And this is where it becomes an actual problem, where it actually overwhelms what you actually do, because it's what you're willing to do with that material wealth or gain. Do you actually want to actually use it to develop something that's actually productive, or do you just want to basically let it sit there? And are you just looking to get into the point of hoarding? Now, there's a lot of people who end up being miserly and try to hoard money, and are just looking for the point of power, and that's where it ends up being under the point of lust as well. And that's where greed is tends to fall under the idea of lust. It's not necessarily for greed as in the desire of basically of success. Success is not and greed are completely different. And this is what needs to be understood, because the idea of success is you're looking for an actual goal, and you're looking to actually develop something and actually make something that improves the lives of workers, the lives of yourself, your family, and the lives of the consumer, and offer something that the consumer wants from the actual aspect of a business owner, or from a labor they're looking for to improve their standing. But it will also they'll also view themselves as being more productive in the actual function of the society, which will be beneficial for whatever company that they were working for, or whatever they happen to be doing, which is actually not considered as being negative. They're actually going in what would be their self-interest. And again, self-interest is not viewed as being negative. This goes back to the same thing. We don't see self-interest under the 7 deadly sins. We don't see self-interest under the 7 virtues either, because it's considered natural. Because as we see what we call under the, especially with the reason why we notice this is under the idea of gluttony. Gluttony, it says, is the desire to eat or consume more than you require. Now, this would mean that basically is there's basically some type of level of human requirement for certain things. And this is the idea of something of a idea that there is something that we're talking about the individual coming first. And this is something where where we're talking where self-interest is right up there with it, and that would be essentially something of self-interest, and these are and there is and these things are coming at self-interest, and that's why we have these areas in between would be under self-interest. So something that doesn't fit something in which is a normal desire, but it's not a but it doesn't fit under a violation of a deadly sin, would be considered as being sinful, such as basically just a desire to basically consume what is necessary. And when you start to see this is you'll start to see this the idea of basically self-interest is something that is core to essentially the psychological sustainability and the ability for the individual to function in society, and it must come before anything else. And this is where we're going to see that a lot of our problems with mental health have actually broken down because of this, and why we have so much issues with mental health, because we've put so much we've essentially gone backward with what we've functioned on, because we've gone toward the idea of this collective over the individual, and that's a very disturbing idea, because we need to focus on the individual before the before anybody else, and that's something that's very important. And this is something that basically all of these psychologists and psychiatrists have to essentially retrain everyone to learn. And doesn't matter which office we're talking about, every office is basically trying to retrain people this. And when we see these people like Barack Obama teaching people this, they're teaching people harmful behavior that's basically only ends in basically massive psychiatric problems. And this is something that's very, very bad, because you're not your brother's keeper. Frankly, your number one role in life is to be your own self's keeper, because you're going to have your own function in life that's going to be very, very important. That's your number one goal. Your number one goal in life is to take care of yourself, because when it comes down to everything, that's your number one goal in life. Because if you don't, you're essentially in life, what you're doing is you're destroying God's creation. And God didn't create you to basically destroy yourself. That's completely insane. And if you don't believe in God, then you got to think with it is, why are you essentially destroying yourself for no legitimate reason? If you're living for your own self, then why would you destroy yourself? If you believe this is the only life on earth, why would you destroy yourself for no legitimate reason? I mean, does that seem insane? You're basically going to give up your life for someone else that you don't know, or even if it's a relative, it doesn't matter. Are you going to basically do that when it makes no sense? In the end, you need to understand that basically is your well-being needs to come first over anything else, and that needs to take place over everything else, because the fact is we need to understand that that self-interest needs to come first, because when we start to eliminate that and eliminate all your needs first with it, basically we're going to essentially displace all of the ways society works, and the mental and we're going to have a huge mental breakdown in society. And this is why we're having a lot of mental problems in society, because people are not taking care of themselves mentally. They're not taking care of themselves at all. And this is why we have high levels of depression in this country, because they're being taught the completely wrong things. They're being taught that, oh, you're your brother's keeper. Well, no, you're not. You're your own self's keeper. You take care of your own self. That's it. When there's someone who's wrong, yes, you would have called. Yes, you can help them out, but it's not your obligation. It's if you want to. There's no obligation for anything in life except for to take care of yourself, because that's called self-interest, nothing more. And when we start to view anything beyond that, when anybody tells you anything beyond that, they're talking crazy talk. And that's the whole point, is when they're doing that, they're basically trying to push the idea of collectivism, because they want to forward a certain narrative. And that's the whole idea. And or they've been brainwashed with a certain narrative, and they don't know any better. When in case of Obama, he's trying to push a certain narrative, and that's the whole point. So when he's going out to these colleges, he's trying to push a certain narrative, or high schools or whatever. He's trying to push a certain narrative, and it's complete and utter hogwash, because he knows what he's doing, and he knows the fact is it's going to harm a lot of people's actual mental stability, and it's horrible, because you're going to have more mental problems. And guess what's going to happen? And people are going to have to have some type of outpatient mental care, being visiting psychiatrists or psychologists on these problems that are going to be developing, and it's going to cause a huge issue. When if they would actually be told that you're your own self's keeper to begin with, that you don't have to worry about others, you have to worry about yourself, that you need to basically focus on the one person who matters, and basically if you don't, you're going to die. And because the fact is, you're going to bring yourself into massive depression, and you're going to probably lead yourself possibly with suicidal thoughts because of that, because you're focusing on these other areas that really don't even matter. When you focus on your brother's keeper, I'm sorry to tell you with it, but you're going to keep doing that. And guess what? You realize how many people are in the world today. When we start to look at the actual population, you're going to see is that you look at the population in the world, we're talking currently is let's see, yeah, currently we're over 7 billion people. Yeah, really, you really think you're going to keep up with trying to make a difference in one of those 7 billion? Let's take a look at we're at with our population, we would be at we're at about just shy of about 330 million people. So if we look at that, we could say that we could look at that and we could say that, hey, we're you could say that okay, what about with the United States? Okay, we're at 330 million people, or just shy thereof, and you're not even going to make, from the people in the United States, you're not even going to make a dent in that, just in helping people there. You realize how what it is to help just 1% of those people? You have to help over, you have to help about 3.3 million people to help one, you're talking just to help, just to help 1% of them, about 3.3 million people. Just to help, just to be your brother's keeper to 1% of those people. 0.1%, 330,000 people. You really think you can keep up with that? And guess what's going to happen? You're going to basically be really overstressed with that. This is why we actually say that you're not going to be able to have the ability to keep up with them. And that's why we end up doing this. And this is why we say you need to look out as and look as being focused on being an individual first. And this is very important. If you don't look out as an individual, then what you're going to do is you're going to create a huge problem for yourself. And that's why this idea of being your brother's keeper is totally illegitimate. And this is why the idea of being worrying about yourself is not considered sinful. As I showed you with the idea of going through the 7 deadly sins and going through the 7 virtues, not one area was considering looking out for oneself as being sinful. It was, if you look at the area in between, it was actually considering it as a norm, and it concerns that as actually normal behavior. And what we've done is we've actually tricked ourselves to think that this is an actual somewhat sinful behavior to think about oneself first, and we've actually superseded with thinking that we need to focus on some type of focus the virtues above this normal behavior, as if it were some type of like level of a game or something that we have to we're trying to score points or something, and that's completely illegitimate. Those are what it called. Those are where you're supposed to try to do some positive things in your life. Both of those are not by any stretch of the imagination goals of what you're supposed to do in every aspect of your life. That would be insane, because that would be going against the actual best interest of oneself, and that's not that would not be sane, and that would not and that would never be that would never be what would be recommended by even what they would even state in any biblical text. No biblical text would actually recommend going against one's self-interest, because going against one's self-interest, especially if doesn't matter what it was with it, if it was already at the benefit of many people, would never say go against that. That would be insane. And they wouldn't be saying go against one's self-interest if it were basically going to negatively impact yourself. That would be horrible. They would never say, hey, harm yourself, do self-harm. They would never do that. No point would actually say a virtue is self-harm. That's not what a virtue is. You never saw on there that saying a virtue is self-harm. I never mentioned anything of virtue as being self-harm, and that's because virtues aren't self-harm. They're actually meant for self-improvement, and that's the whole point. They're meant to actually improve society around you, and they're actually meant as kind of extras on top of what you're doing as self-interest. And that's the whole point. This is why the idea of objectivity can actually exist within the worlds of religion. And it's kind of a unique factor. And this is where we need to understand. And you're not going to get it by just trying to essentially skip this point and trying to basically say, I'm going to go against self-interest and skip that and try to live under just the virtues alone. The virtues alone cannot exist without actually self-interest as a base. Self-interest as a base that's going to be your baseline, because you need to act that way, otherwise you're not going to have a stable mental mind to actually enact those virtues. Those virtues are not essentially a code. That's not a complete code to live under. Those are just virtues. That's why they say it's not a code. Those are just virtues to live under, as in recommendations, to live in addition to an idea of self-interest. There's a difference between virtues and self-interest. Between virtues and an actual code. When we're talking an actual code, that's very, very specific, where it extends beyond that point, and it will actually give you more instructions. This simply because it doesn't, we see that it's meant to add on top of it, add on top of the way you're currently living, and it's only supposed to basically give you instructions on top of it. Basically say don't do these things with it and you're good, and that's basically about it. And to live within these kind of instructions, and that's basically it was meant to basically be a counter to the 7 deadly sins and this as the 7 virtues, which means that what we're talking about it was still telling people to live within self-interest. And so the idea of being your brother's keeper was never meant as an actual thing, because to do so would be against one's self-interest, and the idea would be going against an actual tenet of actually protecting one's best interest to survival. And that's something that there would be actually against just the level of hierarchy of how these things go. You need self-interest, then you graduate up to those next level for those virtues would be next. Basically, that's how it would go. You don't go with the idea of the virtues only, because the fact is, if you cannot live just on those virtues alone. They don't exist in their own little realm. And basically, one cannot just live on those virtues and as an actual code itself. Because if you look at the actual rules, you could see that they're not. One could not explicitly live on those 24/7, 365. and that's just basically giving as a code of what to do instead of the seven deadly sins as what would be considered virtuous to do. And that's merely what it was meant to do, is merely as a counteraction to the seven deadly sins, as basically what is the polar opposite of it. And that's merely what it was, and that's all it was considered as, and nothing more. There was basically, as to live neutrally, it was meant to actually live within self-interest, and that's basically what it is. And to deny this like neutral living life is the product of insanity. And when we're talking about that, is why would you do such a thing? And we need to understand that it would be very, very stupid to do such a thing against one's own aspect of health. And this is where we get to, like, why would Obama say this? And he's stating this because he really doesn't care about the aspects of individuals. He wants to develop into the idea of the collective, because the collective is very, very important to him. Because you have to understand is, when we go back to his college experience, is he embraced Marxism. Marxism is a collective system, and thus he wants the collective embraced. So when we view this, we need to understand that. So even though he's not going to embrace this idea of his brother's keeper in any literal or figurative sense, he wants other people to do it, because the fact is it negates any idea of individuality to any type of sense, because they're not looking out for their own self-interest. When you look out for your own self-interest, the idea of collectivism breaks down, and that's the whole point. The idea of collectivism can only stay together when you have people negating their idea of self-interest. Self-interest kills collectivism. It's just a point right there. And when you start doing that, you're going to see that there's no bigger way to be an individual than to say you're going to be out for your own self-interest, because everybody's going to view self-interest in a different way, because everybody has their own wants and needs that are going to be completely different. And that's something that's going to create the actual view of their own individuality that's going to escape. And under collectivism, people can say they're an individual, but all they're doing is picking and choosing out of a bag that's basically been pre-selected. When you look at the idea of acting in their own self-interest, is they can basically devise their own actual settings, and it's something completely different from what the collectivists have actually wanted to select for them. And it breaks away from what these Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Bernie Sanders, Barack Obamas, Elizabeth Warrens, and so on and so forth have wanted to pre-select for them. And it's basically, this is why we get these whole things like that, why they try to select these terms. Now when we look at that, and now what would be the outcome of when we start to look at it as individuals is, we'll look at it as ourselves as individuals first, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to be heartless, because if we look at ourselves as people, you'll see the fact is that, just even on YouTube, we'll see so many charity drives. I've mentioned previously that we've developed a lot of money through that. When we look at the United States, anytime there's what we call, with the level of charity, there's so much money given, and usually those who support more voluntarism are more apt to give more during, even when it comes to tipping at restaurants. Those who support force are usually more likely to tip less than the minimum, or tip at or less than the minimum when it comes down to it. Liberals are more likely to tip at or less than the minimum. When it comes down to like conservatives or libertarians, they're more likely to tip well above the minimum, and this shows a clear difference between what actually happens when we're talking about people that are acting within their own self-interest. Now, they're acting within their own self-interest, but they're more than willing to give certain amounts that would essentially be viewed as, hey, that would be against that actual bare minimum. If they were only looking in their financial self-interest from an actual just financial end, but they viewed the case of that this person deserves more than the actual minimum, and this is the case, and this is what we usually see, and that's why they end up tipping more, and that's why they end up giving more to charity. And when we come to this country, we see that we can develop a lot more money toward charity to that, because of when we have people act in self-interest. And this is something where self-interest can be very, very positive for many people. And when we see that going against it, it's really very, very destructive toward many people, and we don't need it. When we go against that. That's why the idea of my brother's keeper is just a destructive idea to begin with, and it really needs to go. It really needs to die a horrible death, because when we view it, it's just people are thinking, oh, it's a very, very nice idea with it, and it means helping others with it. No, it just means collectivism, and that's all it really means. The idea of actually helping people needs to be helping people out of good faith, and helping those who actually need help. And it's done that naturally through the idea of people looking out for their own self-interest first, and then helping others when they need it. I mean, even when you get on a damn plane, what do they say? Basically, is deal with yourself first, and then you can help others. That's it. They even tell you that on a plane, of helping others when dealing with some type of event. I mean, even on a plane, they tell you this. Of working within self-interest, because they even know this self-interest comes out to being the best outcome, and because they know if you were trying to be your brother's keeper, that everything would be going haywire, and that nothing would be done, because you would have essentially all these mix-ups happening because of it. Doesn't matter if we're talking putting on belts, or what it called dealing with an actual crash or whatever, or how to actually get out during a crash or whatever, or to what it called, or to exit during one of these like water crashes or something. But it's the same thing with that, and it's just a matter of they know it's with that. So, and it's a kind of a common known fact that self-interest works, and every area knows it, and they've known it for a long time, and it's the only productive system that actually works. So when people try to say, oh, you need to be your brother's keeper, well, no, you don't. It's non-productive. It's because other areas have known it's non-productive. It doesn't work. It's just basically adds more to the collective system, and it's going to create more people for this to deal with mental health issues. And if we actually want to solve something, we need to look at self-interest first, because when we start looking at self-interest, is the actual outcome of it. It's not selfish. It actually is, the actual outcome becomes a lot better for everyone, and it's just amazing what happens when you look at that. Because when we first came to the when people first came to the United States as the Plymouth Brethren, the first outcome was basically they nearly starved to death because they established a commune, and they were doing this little my brother's keeper thing. After that, with it, they basically said, he who does not grow does not eat. But they still had the idea of using charity to help those who were disabled, and using the idea of those virtues after the point of self-interest. And guess what? They flourished. Now we look at the fact is we have all of these huge benefits of technology. And we look at all of the benefits because of that. Otherwise, if that hadn't happened, everyone would have died. That's why we see the huge difference. Self-interest works. It's always worked. My brother's keeper fails in every attempt. My brother's keeper gives you Venezuela. My brother's keeper gives you the Nazi death camps. My brother's keeper gives you the Soviet Gulag. My brother's keeper gives you these arrested people in Cuba. My brother's keeper gives you these harsh work camps in North Korea. My brother's keeper gives you the countless people killed in Cambodia under Pol Pot. I don't know how many more examples we need to go with. That's what my brother's keeper gives you, because you lose all individual rights. Self-interest gives you an iPhone. Self-interest gives you all these other benefits. I mean, if you prefer the iPhone, to me, I think it's a pain. I think it's a little bit of a pain. My mom has one. I just don't understand how the thing works. I prefer the Android system. But that's what you end up getting is you end up getting all these technology, the smartphone, out in what they call these areas that prefer the My Brother's Keeper. An Apple store means basically a store that sells apples. And the ideas in the countries that basically use the idea of self-interest, an Apple store really means a store run by the company Apple that sells both Apple and Macintosh devices. And was those ones that go My Brother's Keeper, it's a store that's going to sell the actual produce, apples. That's all you're going to get. You're not going to get the electronics devices. They just don't exist out there. Because that's just a fact of what ends up happening. Collectivism just breeds death. Now, if you like this, like, subscribe, click the notification bell, send it all the way around social media to your friends and everybody publicly. And if you feel so inclined, make a monthly donation right here below over here. And it starts at $1 and goes all the way up to the minimum of $100 a month. I prefer the $100 a month, just kind of BSing with people. I know that's kind of a lot to give, but any amount will be very, very generous. But to those who want to give to my who want to be patrons and be any Patreon subscribers, I would really appreciate that. It really helps me because I'm on disability. But that's about it, and you'll see the link right below for those who weren't in the live stream and just are seeing the repeat. But that's about it, and I will see you guys for my next video, and that's bye everyone.